Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast, Achieve Better Data Quality by Improving Metadata Governance with SAP PowerDesigner. I'd like to start off with a couple of introductions today and a few housekeeping items. Our first speaker is Jeff Giles. Jeff is a Sandhill Enterprise Architect, a long-time SAP PowerDesigner Enterprise Architect user, and also very familiar with data architecture and data governance. Jeff's been the one that's been driving our focus of addressing the issues of the convergence of data modeling and data governance during the past several years. In addition, you'll also hear from Marcy Barton-Goodwin, who's going to be our second speaker. Marcy is the founder and CEO of Access Software Designs, who've been providing education consulting services to Fortune 1000 companies and government entities for several years. Marcy's also an expert in the field of enterprise model management, and also the co-creator of a product we'll be reviewing as well as PowerDesigner today, which is EM-SOS. Marcy's company, Access Software Design, is a valued partner to Sandhill, and together we offer EM-SOS, our metadata management framework for PowerDesigner, to our clients. You are, of course, listening to Robert Ludden, Vice President, Sandhill Consultants, and I'd like to just do a quick introduction of the two companies that are on the call today. Obviously, Jeff, you can go to that second slide. So our two companies, Sandhill Consultants. So Sandhill Consultants is a consultancy organization, and I realized that I should probably define consultancy a little bit better. We are experts in the CMMI, DMM space, data management space, as well as data governance, data modeling, and data design. We help organizations build and design comprehensive data architectures focused on solid data management practices, which you will see here, and practices that can deliver solid, trusted, and data-enabled organizations to reduce risk and achieve compliance. Sorry, I had to get something out of my way on the screen there. Access Software Designs, our partner company that Marcy's on the call with, is a consulting and product development organization specializing in enterprise model management infrastructures. And in partnership with Sandhill, Access Software delivers EM-SOS, a comprehensive metadata management framework based upon data governance best practices. So Jeff, can you go to the next slide? Next slide after that, because I think you've gone the wrong way. So in this presentation, we're going to be looking at how an organization can proactively improve data governance by extending data quality efforts with PowerDesigner and best practices. And we're going to look at the following critical aspects of metadata standardization, quality control processes to manage change, and reusable data objects. And it was interesting, we had a stat that we sent out in the email that it's been recently reported that many organizations fail to reuse up to 70% of their metadata assets. And we find that this is in part due to the failure of creating a proper infrastructure which facilitates the reuse of metadata and the consistent use of rules governing metadata standards. Something that we can show you how to improve with SAP PowerDesigner and EM-SOS. And for folks out there, we are recording this session. We will post it on our YouTube channel afterwards. And so with the introductions and topic covered, I'd like to pass it over to Jeff to kick off the session by reviewing the agenda before us. Jeff.
Thanks, Robert. So as Robert mentioned, these are some of the concepts around data governance that we're going to talk about in conjunction with two things. EM-SOS, which is an application that's going to allow us to document some of these concepts, and more specifically, policy standards, procedures, data structures, and their reusability, monitoring and measuring things within the data model context, guidelines and best practices around how to build, develop, and manage a model, as well as communication and accessibility to all this information that we're going to discuss. So this slide here, we're really talking about the intersection of the data governance concepts with the modeling technology. So if you read a couple of data governance books out there, they always talk about this idea that you have to take your data governance practices and you have to integrate them into your regular IT practices or business practices, but they never actually talk about how you get that done. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So if you look over on the right-hand side, in the center here, it says standards and procedures. It's all about what work that we have to do, who's going to do it, how are we going to get it done. So the circles around it are essentially the component parts to getting this done. You need to understand a little bit about your data governance practices that you're going to implement. Some best practices on things that have been tried in the past and work very well. The metadata that you're going to manage, and the modeling, which in this case is PowerDesigner, the tool that's going to allow all these things to come together. So that's kind of where we're going to go today. So this talks about the general processes around governance and modeling. So governance policy over here on the left is not about the policies of the business. It's really the policies of how do we do modeling? What is our goals? What are our objectives? What is the requirements we want for a quality model? Then we have to take those and we have to turn them into procedures, like exactly how step by step we're going to accomplish these particular activities so that they can be consistent and repeatable. And then we move over to the standards. So one of the byproducts of creating a model is creating all that metadata. So there's some standardization around the rules around when we create an entity, create an attribute. You know, how do we do that? And what are the standards for a good quality piece of metadata? And then towards the metadata side, that metadata, assuming it's gone through a standardization process, becomes more trustworthy. So then people can look at it and know that in this model, this definition with these attributes is a valid representation of how the business sees that concept. And then lastly, monitoring. Obviously, when we build these models, they are not static and never change. They change over time. So we have to monitor change. We have to manage how that change is going to happen throughout the model. So that's generally the flow from the data modeling context and how we're going to apply some governance concepts on top of that. So what I want to do right now is just take a few minutes to introduce Marcy, who's going to talk a little bit about EM-SOS and what it is before I actually jump into showing you how it relates to PowerDesigner. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Marcy.
Hi all, thank you so much for joining us. So, as we saw from the previous slide, there's quite a need for some sort of infrastructure, standards, procedures, and so forth. Trusting your metadata to have the correct definitions and so forth is pretty much of a wide-ranging issue. What we've discovered is that most companies recognize the need for data governance, especially in the area of metadata, and they do understand that standards and procedures and managing the metadata process, if you will, is required. But the challenge has been that there really aren't usually in-house resources available to implement an infrastructure. Everybody already has a full plate. So whether there's a lack of the required skill sets or a lack of time, those people just aren't available to do this. We've been in this space for a long time. And so what we also found out and what we realized over time was that folks were not necessarily using their data modeling tools to the full potential of the tool. In reality, we're creating metadata in PowerDesigner. That's where it's created and so forth. So since we had a good tool with a lot of good functionality, what we needed to do was organize that within an infrastructure of a metadata management system or a foundation. Okay, Jeff, next slide, please. So we created EM-SOS, Enterprise Modeling Set of Standards. This is a framework. It includes everything that you see listed here, and it's meant to work specifically with your tool. So by starting with EM-SOS, which has all of this in it, a company has a huge jump start on implementing this infrastructure that's required. And it includes everything that we know that you need, which are all the things that are listed. So you don't have to start from scratch. We give you a robust baseline. It's very easy to customize, which saves time and money and effort to get all of this in place. The content has all been written with the strategy of having all of the standards, procedures, and so forth around a strategy of reuse. Reusability within the tool, within PowerDesigner, in terms of reusing data structures, is the key to being able to standardize and to be able to have the tool work for you. Everything is in one place. Everybody who needs to see all this information can get to it, and it will guide you through the best use of all of the great functionality that PowerDesigner has. Okay, Jeff, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay.
Actually, yes. Let me just say that this first slide, we're just going to show you a few slides of the EM-SOS, and then we're going to show you how it relates specifically to PowerDesigner, and Jeff is going to do that. I just want to give you an idea of the interface here that you're looking at. This is EM-SOS, and you'll see that on the left, you have an index. There are standards, there are standard operating procedures, we have checklists and so forth. Jeff will go into more detail about this. The content is on the right, and what you're looking at is a SharePoint version of EM-SOS for PowerDesigner. And you'll notice across the very top, you have some breadcrumbs that show you where you are, and one of those says workflow. SharePoint gives us the ability to give you workflows, security, and a multi-user environment. So, Jeff, I'm going to hand this over to you and let you go into some details.
Great. Thank you, Marcy. So let me just jump into the first section here for the EM-SOS. The first section is the data model lifecycle. So in this screenshot here, you can see that we've got a procedure, and those procedures are numbered with sub numbers to it. But essentially, this describes what the data model lifecycle is. Now, many different organizations have different data model lifecycles. Some will start at an enterprise data model, drive those changes down to a project model, and then drive them into, let's say, some physical and build a database that way. Some people just have a logical model that represents a project, and they just build their data models that way. So your data model lifecycle changes depending on how you want to approach it. What I'm going to do right now is just talk about how this relates to some of the models that PowerDesigner has. PowerDesigner has 3 distinct different types of data models. Each one of these represents a different focus. So starting at the top is what PowerDesigner calls a conceptual data model. Sometimes they call this a CDM. Now, conceptual in terms of PowerDesigner is it's a data model type. Doesn't mean that you have to create what's called a conceptual data model with it. It's just simply saying that if you need to model things that are from a business perspective, you can use this model. So it's good for describing what the business view of the rules are, the relationships. This is probably where I make sure I have all my definitions. It's a very high level of abstraction, and it's database independent. So this is where I would be sort of defining things like my critical data elements for the business and what the definitions of those things are and how those things relate to other things. You'd probably have a lot of many-to-many relationships in this particular kind of model. Now, the model at the bottom is the physical data model. Now, this is simply the implementation type model. So this is where you pick a particular DBMS platform, Oracle, DB2, SAP, whatever the platform is, to build out the physical model. Now, the logical model in PowerDesigner is a bit of a hybrid. What it is, it's a semi-technical model. And you'll see here that that yellow oval actually overlaps the business and the operational sections because pieces of the operational area and the business area are in that technical logical data model. So the logical data model type in PowerDesigner is a semi-technical mid-level abstraction, but it's still database independent. Now, when we take all these models and start to create them in PowerDesigner, we have the ability to link these models together. And this is what establishes your data model lifecycle. So if we look at this diagram on the far left-hand side, there's one model, and then there's a series of arrows that are driving to the right side on this. Essentially, that model represents a high-level business conceptual data model. From that, I can do something called a generation, which will generate another model of another abstraction layer. This is how PowerDesigner manages going from conceptual data model to a logical data model to a physical data model. So each time we decompose through this analysis level, we get closer and closer to the technical implementation. But we can also go the other way. We can also take a model that we reverse engineered from a database and we can drive it upwards towards a more abstract business view. So the life cycle goes top down or bottom up. So it all depends on how you organize it. But in addition to that, there's this concept of a map. So in the world of data warehousing, you might have something called a source to target map. You might want to know what operational source is feeding what data mart or data warehouse. So in PowerDesigner, there's this concept of mapping things together. So there's really three different types of ways of linking these models together. You can create generation links, which represents a life cycle generation, mapping, which indicates a source to target concept, and then references are links that you develop or you assign to artifacts that you think are important. So in this case, there's a little model there at the bottom with a little exclamation point that's representing something called a requirements model. So that requirements model is part of that data mart that was generated from, let's say, a finance system that was originated at a top level subject area called finance in the business area. So all of these things are linked together within PowerDesigner. The beauty of the linkages is that then you can do an impact and lineage analysis. So if you look at the diagram on the right, the letter A is representing your original artifact that you have a question about. If you expand and do an impact and lineage analysis, you can see all of the direct relationships to this thing called a sales order. But then below that, you can see generated objects, and you can see that this logical object was generated as a physical table called sales order. You can also see a little bit further down, there's something called target mappings. This is being mapped to another data model. So this establishes what the mappings are to a dimension called sales order. And then down towards the bottom, there's something called generation origin, which is where it came from. And if you look to the far end inside the brackets, you can see lineage and change. Change represents what would happen downstream, and lineage represents what happens upstream. So the beauty of this is to be able to understand how all these things fit together. But the thing with EM-SOS is you need to define how you're going to manage this entire generation process. If you have everybody generating models whenever they want, you're going to lose control. So you need to have a well-defined generation process, that's the life cycle, of how you're going to manage these things. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into PowerDesigner for a quick sec and show you essentially what these models are and how this works. So on my screen here on the far left-hand side, we've got a series of models. And this model here is the high-level conceptual data model. You'll notice that in this high-level conceptual data model, we have things like supertype, subtype. So in this banking example, there's this concept of an account. An account can have a checking account or a savings account, and there's some discernible differences between the two. This is a business concept for business people that want to be able to understand, do we just have checking and savings accounts? Well, no, we have credit card accounts, we have loans, we have all kinds of financial products that we might offer. But at least at this high level, we begin to understand what they are. There's also this idea of a many-to-many relationship where I don't have to put in any kind of intermediate table here. So this is purely a business level model. Now, from this business level model, I can go down to, let's say, a system level model here and start to look at things in terms of the physical options for a particular DBMS target. I can actually look at the, let's see, where are my preview. Oh, that's what I'm looking for. The actual DDL that you would use to build this particular model in your target DBMS. So this represents the lowest level, and the account sample represents the highest level. This model here represents something like a data mart. And then from the tools menu, I can actually show the mapping editor that shows that I have an account system, and that system has tables, and those tables are mapped to a data warehouse, and those data warehouse options map, or those things map across. So here I can see the mapping. So this is the mapping part of my life cycle. So those things are all there. So the idea that I can go in and I can say, well, I'm interested in knowing, let's say, for instance, this entity called account. If I right click on it, I can do an impact and lineage analysis, which will in turn tell me that it has direct relationships, it has inheritances that are inherent to other objects. They're applicable to a particular table. That table has a particular mapping, and it might also be associated with some business process. So the idea here is that in this lifecycle concept, I can build lots of different models, I can connect them all together, and I can do an impact and lineage analysis. But for you, you have to be able to document what the process is, what the procedure is, how are we going to manage this lifecycle, and that's where the EM-SOS part comes in. So let me pop back out here and take a look at the next slide here. This is the metadata quality control standards. Now, in the quality control standards, this is where we set up what constitutes a good data model object. Like I said, you're building metadata by the fact that you're building data models. So we need to be able to understand what constitutes a good logical data model object. So in this section here, you can see here on the left, that could be an attribute, a data item, a domain, an entity, an inheritance, a relationship. There's also physical data objects as well. So within this area, you're able to go in and drill in and find out just exactly what constitutes a proper data model object. So let's go into PowerDesigner and take a look at that. Actually, no, what we should do is let's go into EM-SOS and take a look at that. If I click on standards here, okay, and expand this node, you can see here we've got an area called object naming. If I select object naming, it'll tell me exactly what the policies are. So often people say, well, why do we have to do this anyways? I mean, it's just slowing me down. All this extra stuff is just backlogging us. Well, there's a reason why we have to do it, right? So you can define what the policies are and the purposes are. So let's say, for instance, the business said, look, if we can't interoperate, and that means we can't share information from one subject area to another or one business to another, that's going to cripple the business. So being able to define what the policy is and why we're actually doing it. Who does it affect? What's the scope? Who's really got to be part of this? What are the responsibilities for the project manager, the data architect, the data steward? What's the definition of how we're going to format this stuff? So all of this stuff is defined here within this object naming. And if I expand the logical object and click on the entity, then I'll be able to go into the entity and see what constitutes a proper name, a proper definition. Oftentimes people do things not because they want to throw a monkey wrench in the works. Most of the time they just don't know what they need to do. So sometimes it's helpful to be able to come in and say, oh, okay, I need to create an entity. What kind of entity is it? Is it an associative entity, attributive entity? Is it a supertype? Okay, what are the rules around how we would name that? What is allowed? What is not allowed? So this saves you later when you go to look at things through, let's say, quality control checklist or something like that. At least you know you've hit these things and you've got all the proper names in there. So in the case of PowerDesigner, we have the ability to go in here and look that stuff up and define what the proper naming standard might be for something. So if I go into this and I say, okay, here's an account. Account should have a proper definition. It should have a proper abbreviation, and it should have a proper name. So in here is where I can make sure that I have some of that stuff captured, as well as where the attribute information is. What is the naming code for an attribute? Things like that. They're all here. Now, within PowerDesigner, you do have the ability to set up what are called naming standards. So they're under your model options, and it's under naming convention. And when you look at it, there's this ability to synchronize the code and the name together, and to turn on what's called a conversion template. So here, the name tab here tells me, well, what's the business name going to be? Mixed case, uppercase, lowercase, title case, what characters are allowed, what characters are not allowed. Code tab, is it going to be uppercase, lowercase, lower camel case, upper camel case? So you can set the name from the code, different standards. Name to code, this is sort of a macro that says, okay, how do we separate words in our naming convention? Obviously in camel code, you don't have any spaces. In other conventions, you have what's called an underscore character, and that's what this convention is, saying that the first name will be applied, followed by an underscore, followed by the next name. And it's being driven through something called a conversion table. In the conversion table, you can have as many different conversion tables as you want, but a conversion table is nothing more than a name and a code listing for how this is going to be applied. And if you look over here, there's one file in PowerDesigner called std names. It's a CSV file, and this CSV file comes with PowerDesigner. You can either augment this one, or you can develop your own custom one. It doesn't matter. But once this is enabled, then you can go ahead and it will help drive some of your naming conventions. So let's take, for instance, if I wanted to create a new object here, and I wanted to use the word average, you can see that the code is now AVG. And then if I press the space bar and I said number, you see that I would get an underscore character followed by an abbreviation there. So one of the ways that PowerDesigner enforces some of this governance concept is that when possible, the tool does a fair amount of the heavy lifting, so I don't have to go and remember what is the abbreviation for average. It will go ahead and fill that stuff in for me. And we can pre-program that into a PowerDesigner template so that all the basic settings that you need are already there within PowerDesigner. So let me pop back out here to my PowerPoint for a sec. That's the quality control standards for naming. And here's the idea that we just talked about. There's a synchronization button. Now you can desynchronize the name in the code. So if you wanted to override average with a different abbreviation for, let's say, a legacy system, where if you use that word, it will not work or something like that. So you can always override things if you deem you need to. And you can see them in two types of property sheets: the property sheets that show lists, as well as the single property sheet that lets you change your name and code settings. This is the model options with the naming convention we were just in. And this is the synchronized code. If this is turned off, it won't attempt to synchronize. Enable conversions allows you to suspend the conversion if you want to for some temporary purpose. And this area is where you set the name standard, the code standard, the name to code mapping, and how it's going to drive that name to code. There's also an inverse of code to name. So let's suppose you reverse engineered a physical database. When you do that, there is no business name. But if you wanted to retroactively apply a business name to a database that you reverse engineered, you can do code to name. But in order to make this work, you have to standardize on what those abbreviations are, because if you don't have standard abbreviations, you won't be able to do that. But this is the mechanism in PowerDesigner that makes that happen. And this is the naming standards template. And again, it's nothing more than a name and a code. So this is where you define what are you going to call your object names and what are the abbreviations going to be for that. Now, I've gone on site and I've had people say, Jeff, I like your concept here of abbreviations, but we don't even know how to abbreviate. Like, do you have any standards around how you actually do abbreviations? So this is where the best practices part comes in with EM-SOS. In certain instances, we have gone ahead and collected through our vast experience over time, ways of approaching things. And one of the standard things that people always ask is, how do I create acronyms and abbreviations and make sure they're unique, right? Because one person can go in and say, oh, I'm going to abbreviate customer as CUST. And somebody else will say, well, it's going to be CSTMR. Well, you can only have one instance of customer. You can't have two different abbreviations if you're going to standardize it, that is. And so this talks about how one might go through that process by which you standardize. So let's take a look at that for a quick sec, just to show you where that is. So here in EM-SOS, down here, there's a section called Guidelines. And in Guidelines, there's a number of different guidelines. Some of them are guidelines for graphical standards. Here's the Creating Acronyms and Abbreviations section, which has some details about how you go about abbreviating a word. There's two different techniques in here. There's the vowel technique, which you're probably pretty familiar with, dropping vowels, dropping double consonants. And then there's another one here, which is called the stemming technique, which uses the root word and uses some standards for applying things for plurals, et cetera, et cetera. But again, this is all part of EM-SOS, so that when we look at how we might approach something, that helps us do it. I just need to just go to the site, look at it, and then say, okay, here's how I'm going to approach my abbreviations. So let's go here, back in here, and talk about the glossary. Now, whatever data governance book you read, the number one thing they tell you should do is to establish a good business glossary. Now, in data modeling tools, most of the times you're building what are called data dictionaries. Now, a data dictionary would say, okay, I have an abbreviation. It has a data type, it has a length, it has a precision, it has some technical characteristics to it. That's not what the PowerDesigner Business Glossary is all about. This captures and organizes business terminology from a business perspective. It organizes business rules as well, and that in turn adds context and meaning to models. Trace the term back to the model artifact that represents that term. If you're going to edit the glossary, you have to have administration rights. Now, the reason I put that in here is to say that not anybody can just go in and add a glossary term and modify a glossary term. There has to be a procedure on how you're going to handle that. So that's part of with EM-SOS, you're documenting, okay, who's responsible for maintaining the glossary? What's the procedure for submitting a glossary term to be evaluated? And what are the states it can be in? It can be in a submitted state, it can be in a candidate state, it can be in an approved state. So these are all the things that, if you look through EM-SOS, it helps us to define what that process is going to be. So from PowerDesigner perspective, there is a glossary object browser. It's a hierarchical listing of things. So if you want to build out, let's say, some basic taxonomy, you can set the folder structure up to represent some taxonomy that you might want to represent. I will say that the glossary is no substitute for one of those robust data glossary tools. However, you can import into your business glossary from a CSV file, and you can also export out as a CSV file. So if you might want to start small and say, we're going to build a small business glossary just to show value, and then later on, we might take this and roll it into something like Calibra or Information Steward or something like that, you can drive that to the next level. The glossary term has a series of properties. So the term is obviously the word and the meaning of the word. Notice here that we have name and code. Most standard business glossaries don't have a reference to code. One of the unique things about PowerDesigner is that you will be able to see what its technical abbreviation is as well as its business name. So even though we're not tracking things like data types and lengths and stuff like that, we are actually showing you from a technician standpoint what the name of that thing would be. There's also this concept of a synonym. So for certain words, you might have a number of synonyms, but only one of those is, let's say, the preferred term. So in this case, we might say we have vendor being a synonym for supplier. So supplier is the accepted term, but vendor is used sometimes. And we've standardized on supplier for all new data models, let's say, for instance. And a related term has relevance to that term, but isn't that term. So this is a little confusing, but basically, we can say something like an order is a kind of contract, and that contract is akin to an agreement. So we could say that an order is a kind of agreement, but an order is not, in fact, an agreement unto itself. This helps for people who build out taxonomies. They can see what are the relationships of one term to another term, and then establish some hierarchy around that. The nice thing about the glossary is, that you can use it for auto-completion and compliance checking, another governance concept. So if we say that the preferred term is supplier and not vendor, then if I attempt to type in vendor, then I should be able to get a message telling me what the preferred term is for that. And if you look at the diagram here, where the letter A is, it's pointing to the drop-down that appears, giving you a suggestion. And also under B here, this is where you would turn on and enable the glossary for auto-completion and compliance checking. So let's go into PowerDesigner here and take a look at how that works. So over here is a list of all my models, but down here at the bottom, there are 3 tabs, and in the middle is the glossary tab. And if I look in the glossary tab here, you can set up whatever structure you might want, but you can drill in to an object. If an object has synonyms, you can expand that, and it will tell you what the synonyms are. If I double click here, I can see the name, I can see the standard abbreviation, I can see the definition of what that is, my list of synonyms, and related terms. So a party can be a party of one, it's still a party. So it's not really an organization per se, but it is related to an organization in that parties can be of one or more people. So you have your related terms. So if I look at this and go into my model options where we were before and look at my naming convention, you can see here I don't have currently enabled the glossary for auto-completion and compliance checking. But if I turn it on and I choose OK, then I go in here and attempt to, let's say, use the word company, you can see that I just start typing and it says organization is the preferred term for company. So all I have to do is click it and I've now got that. So another way that the tool helps you establish some kind of governance around things. The other thing is that business rules can be associated with this. So I can go into something like a joint account here. And joint account is defined as the business rule. A business rule can be of certain types, a constraint, definition, fact, formula, a kind of OCL constraint, requirements, or a validation rule. So you can choose to classify your rule however you want. But the nice thing about this is that through traceability links, I can see that this is associated with something called a customer, and it's also associated with a relationship. So if I want to see what are the dependencies and impact in lineage analysis on the business rule, I can now say that this business rule is associated with that entity, which is traceable to something else. And it's also relatable to this many-to-many relationship, which would tell me what the beginning and ending relationship nodes are in that particular impact and lineage analysis. So again, another way that you can use PowerDesigner to enforce some of your standards around your glossary concepts. So back in here, repeatable processes. Now this, of all of them, is probably one of the most important sections, because what this does is it standardizes in how we're going to do things. Oftentimes you'll go into an organization where they have groups of people who do modeling and everybody does their own thing. There's no one standard way that you go through the process of developing a data model, which leads to a couple of things. One, confusion on exactly how we're going to do it. Number two, how do I train the new guy who just came into the department and needs to get up to speed and doing data modeling quickly? You know, first thing they have to do is figure out how to do data modeling. The next thing they need to figure out is what's the process that you guys use to build out your data model. So what you can do when you standardize this is you have the ability to reduce some training time and get somebody up to speed more quickly in how they develop a data model, or how does a change in a data model happen. You know, all of this stuff needs to be documented so somebody can go ahead and see it. And of course, if it's a repeatable process and you document it, you can now audit it as well. So this is a pretty important part. Basic data modeling workflow. So this is just a high-level, very abstract, generic approach to, let's say, building out a data model. You start with your project, you review your requirements, you create a brand new model, you grab some objects, you put it in the model, you make some new objects for that model, you check the model, make sure it's good, then you submit it for review to maybe a manager or somebody in the business. Some notification happens, you have a meeting and you validate, does this model meet the standard, yes or no? If it doesn't, you return it back to the developer or the model creator with some feedback on what they need to do to fix it. If it does pass the standard, that is, it meets all the quality control standards we have, then it becomes the question of, is this a valid model for the purpose we want to use it for? So if somebody needs to build a physical data model, but I've given you a logical model, well, it's not really fit for purpose. So it's not going to pass the test. So here, assuming it's fit for purpose, then you can publish the data model. Publish the data model might mean put it in the data modeling repository. That's just a general approach for how the basic workflow happens with data modeling. Yours may be different and you can customize it for any way that you want. But within PowerDesigner, there is a specific way that you can manage the change process, and it's called a change list. How it works is users create a change list in the repository. They submit those changes for review. An approver looks at it, makes a decision about it, and then the flow starts all over again. So they either approve it, they reject it, or they return it back with some edits that you need to make. Now, within PowerDesigner, this is the mechanism that sort of makes that happen. Starting on the far left and working towards the right, we can see that you have a modeler who makes a model. That model gets checked into the repository as a submission, and it's in the change list. Now, when it's in the change list, it's in an unlocked state. What that means is you can iterate as many times as you want into that model until it's ready for review. Once it's ready for review, you go into the submission process, which padlocks it. It basically says, this is a read-only model. People can look at it, but nobody can edit it until it's released. So once it's in the submission process, an email gets sent to one or more people that need to review it, and they make one of three decisions, or actually the reviewer makes one of three decisions. They either approve it, which means it goes right into the PowerDesigner repository. They reject it, which means it never goes into the repository, or they approve some of the changes, but send others back for further review or further edits. So that's generally the change list and workflow process within PowerDesigner. So there are little icons and statuses when you're working in the repository. So I'll just call these out real quick. We've got in where it says letter A, this is essentially before anything happens. You have a change list folder, and there's another folder called work in progress. Once I check into the change list, it actually goes into the change list folder, but you'll notice that the work in progress folder here for B is its ultimate destination once it's been approved. And it shows you the model, and it shows that there's a little icon on there that looks like a pencil. C indicates the state that you're in when you submit a model. This is the locked part. So once it's locked, it gets a gear icon, and nothing can happen to it until it's finished. Once it's finished, you'll notice that in section D here, the data model is now in the work in progress folder where it was originally intended to go, and the change list is empty. So that's the cycle that PowerDesigner goes through for this change list. During the change list, emails are sent when somebody should be notified to review it, and the decision on the review is also sent back to the person or the person that submitted it. So both parties know what's going on, and you can add as many comments as you want to the submission process for the emails. So let me just show you real quick how that works, because we're running a little short on time here. So let me just go really quick. In my PowerDesigner repository, there's a change list here. You can create a model and check it into a change list. So if I took this customer accounts, let me see if I create a new model here, will probably work much better. Create a new model, logical data model here. Then I can take this logical data model and I can do a check-in. When I do a check-in, I can pick where I want this to go ultimately. So I could say I want it to go to the work in progress folder, but I'm going to submit it as a change list. So the change list goes in there, and I can add as many details as I want in the comments. Once I click on the OK button, then if I go to the repository, you can see here that the work in progress folder has a model in it that needs to be reviewed. The person who's responsible for reviewing it would log in, they would right click on it, check it out, look at it, and then they can make a decision about how they want to handle this model. So if I go here, where am I? Oh. So hang on a sec. Oh, I had to be at this level. At this level, I can choose to approve or reject whatever I want for this model. Once it's been approved and it goes through the approval process, then it is removed from the change list and ends up in the work in progress folder where it was originally supposed to go. So that whole process, that whole change management process is built into PowerDesigner, so that you can manage change, because the old adage is, if you don't manage change, then change will manage you. And obviously, when you're doing data models and creating metadata and having governance, change is the big thing that you want to manage. The next thing we'll talk about here are the reusable data structures. Now, when you go about the process of building models, you usually end up creating models that have objects in them that you'll use in another project for another model. And then what you end up doing is saying, oh, let's just copy that one from this model and let's just paste it in this other model, which might be okay, but what usually ends up happening is you take a model object that's not valid and you use it on another project, which makes it equally more invalid. And then if somebody copies it from that project and puts it into yet another project, you're just propagating the errors all over the place. So the idea here is that you want to create an object that you can use over and over again, but it's gone through a quality control process, which means that you can trust it. It means that other people have looked at it, people in the business have looked at it, technicians have looked at it, everybody's looked at this thing and says, yes, this is good to go. So that's the concept of a reusable data structure. Now, another advantage to that, other than the quality control process, is this idea that you can shorten the time it takes to build out some models. If you have a library of reusable things, you can copy those things and paste them into a model and shorten the time it takes to build those models. Has anybody ever said to you during your modeling process, boy, you guys are so not agile. You are taking so much time. You're slowing us down. I don't even know why we have to work with you guys. This is one of those ways that you can take and reuse an object to build other models without introducing corruption or errors into your modeling process. Now, this is a simple diagram, but you'll notice here we've got certain states within an object. An object can be local only. That means it's only going to be for this particular model, but it's not going to be accepted anywhere else. Candidate says, oh, well, we have an object here which potentially could be a good reusable object, but it hasn't gone through the validation process yet. And of course, the shared data object or global object, this one has gone through that process. So in PowerDesigner, the way that this works is you use the library. Library is a folder that is in the repository, and you can structure it any way you want. You can even name the library folder anything you want to call it. Models that are in the library are automatically pushed out to the user whenever they log on. The thing about the models that are in the library is that they're read-only. You can't change them as a regular data modeler. Only a person authorized to make changes to objects in the library is able to make those changes. Again, this is where EM-SOS comes in, where you need to document that process by which who is responsible for the library, what kind of authority do they have, who do they have to check with to make sure that the model object is a good object, and all those types of things. Because PowerDesigner gives you the functionality, but it doesn't always build that process on top of it. So within the library, you can have a local library or a shared library. Here we'll be talking about the shared library, and in the shared library, these are the kinds of resources that you can keep in here. The conversion tables that I talked about earlier, they can be managed through the library. Any kind of model extensions can be managed through the library. Templates, projects, all kinds of things can be managed through the library, as well as regular model artifacts. So let me do this and go into PowerDesigner quickly here and talk about this library and how it works. So in the repository you see here, I've got this library. And in the library, I've got this thing called resources. This would be my naming conversion or my naming convention standards. If I have extensions, they'll be in here. If I have model templates, report templates, all of these things can be managed from within the library, which means you can grab them and use them. You can't change them, but you can grab them and use them. I set up a folder in here called shared objects. And in shared objects, you can have shared data objects. And then I might have a logical model or a physical model or a conceptual model that has a bunch of objects in it that I might want to use. And in this case, there's one called an account. Another approach to this is to just use like a pattern model concept. There have been authors to books like Len Silverstein's Data Model Resources book, where he defines a whole bunch of patterns. David Hayes also gone through and built a lot of books, created a lot of books on patterns and using patterns. So this is another place where you can use a pattern or use an object. But if I go back here, a library is local to me, the modeler. And I can see that these are all the things that I have subscribed to. So if you think about this, the library is essentially like the New York Times. It has a bunch of different sections in it. It's got the sports section, politics, entertainment, but you pick the stuff that's relevant to you, the stuff you want to read, and that's the stuff that's going to be in your resources. Here I've said, okay, well, there are my shared data objects. I have a shared data object, and here it's called an account. I might create, let's say, for instance, a brand new logical data model here and say, okay, this is the new model. I'm going to see what I've got that I can reuse for the new project. So then I can go in here, look at my shared objects, see that I have an account concept here. I can select this. I can drag it in. I can copy it here. You can't move it here because it's read-only. You can create a shortcut to it, and you can create a replica. Here I'm going to create a copy. And if I go into my copy, I can look at this object and say, okay, this has to do with an account. It has maturity date and terms. They are not applicable for this particular project. So I can go in here and say, terms, I don't need. Maturity date, I don't need. But I do want all these other things. And so here I've got these this information here. I can add more. I can extend it. I can do whatever I want to this. So this model that I just created not only has the entity called account, but it brought all the domains along with it. So this is my starting point. So now I can start to build this out. I know with some reasonable certainty that this has gone through the quality control process. Everything in here is checked. Everything is good. And I can use this with any kind of new model or new project that I want to. So if I go back here into my PowerPoint, once you start to do this stuff, you can start to create measures and metrics on how many reused objects that you used in your models. So when you first start this process out, everything that you create is going to be brand new because it's not gone through the process yet. However, after a while, you'll start to reuse some of these standard data objects, and then you can actually calculate what's the composition of my model. If 50% of the objects I'm using are reusable, that should shorten my development time. And it should help me move my maturity level up a little bit. So the idea here is I have some defined measures and metrics. Lots of times people say, well, how do we know, like what's our ROI on all this EM-SOS stuff? I mean, how do we even know it's working? Well, this is where you do return on reuse. The more stuff I reuse, the better off I'm going to be because I'm going to be a lot faster in how I'm going to build these things out because I don't have to double check with somebody and say, is this the right object? Is this the correct definition? Do I have all the entities I need? A lot of that stuff will already be there. So let me pop into PowerDesigner one last time here and talk about this idea of being able to say, I've got some idea of how I want to manage or measure something. Let me close up my library. Let me go into my account systems model. Yeah. So if I go into my account systems model, you can create extensions in PowerDesigner that do lots of things. But one of the things that I can do in here is I can modify this thing called a stereotype and say, is this a candidate object, a non-standard object, a standard data object, or we haven't defined it yet. I don't even know whether it's either. So I could say, oh, this one here, that's a standard data object. So now I can have something that will color code that. I can go in here. I can do the same thing through my stereotypes here and say, this one's a good candidate, but we haven't validated it yet. You can use it, but you use it at your own discretion. And then let's say, for instance, we haven't gotten this one to be reviewed, or they want to break away from our standard. Now, this happens from time to time where people say, yeah, I know you got these standards, but we want to go on our own way and do our own thing because that's what we want to do. So you can say, fine, you can go ahead and do that. We will call that object you're making a non-standard data object, which means nobody else is ever going to use that again on another project because this one is different from our valid data object. So again, you can define these things. Once you've defined these things, then you can go in and you can say, hey, I want to look at all of my, let's say, tables that have a certain, let's say, stereotype, and then I can list the stereotypes in my layout here, and I can say, oh, okay, now I know, based on my stereotype listing, what's standard objects, what are non-standard, what is a candidate, and then this little button here lets me push everything out to Excel. And so in Excel, I can do pivot tables, I can do charts and graphs and all kinds of stuff. So that pretty much wraps up my section. I don't think I left a lot for time for Robert here, but let me hand it back to Robert so that he can talk about EM-SOS in relationship to PowerDesigner.
Hey, Jeff, thanks very much indeed. It certainly shows that there's a lot of capability in the PowerDesigner toolset. And one of the things that we're advertising is with the toolset PowerDesigner and EM-SOS, we really can help an organization map what to do, how to do. I'll just quickly go into some of the key benefits that we have, hopefully our viewers have seen. From an enterprise managed modeling environment, there's no doubt that organizations are going to get to where we're at. So if you want to jumpstart, our EM-SOS framework will save time, money, and effort, because we have defined all the critical standards, procedures, guidelines, templates, forms, reports, and workflow. We talked about, and you showed, Jeff, the establishment of data model life cycles. That's critical for end-to-end integration, quality control, and the process to ensure quality data is the output, which is a goal of all organizations. We looked at the metadata quality control standards and how together PowerDesigner and EM-SOS can assist in finding information and increasing interoperability. The repeatable processes, you talked about how it reduces training time and increases consistency. You just showed the defined measures and metrics, which you can now monitor the quality control process and the ROI on that objective. And of course, the one thing that we haven't really talked about, but this is a centralized communication mechanism which decreases confusion, allows an enterprise-wide communication of the tool set. Jeff, you want to go to the next slide? I've just got a couple of slides as we wrap up here. It's our hope that the folks that are watching this video and have seen this demonstration will understand and see how together PowerDesigner and EM-SOS can help assist an organization in converting what to do into how to do. As I say, most organizations will eventually figure out that this is what they need, but the problem is they're going to spend months, if not years, trying to build it. And as Marcy says at the beginning, this is why we built EM-SOS. Go ahead to the next slide, Jeff. So we've seen, what EM-SOS provides, but what I'd like our viewers to consider that if they're looking to build any of this in the organization, whether it's establish their data model lifecycle, develop their quality control standards or repeatable processes, define the data structures, define metrics, or develop a centralized communication mechanism, we can help. And that's why we wanted to put this webcast together. Jeff, go ahead, next slide. So Sandhill understands, that we can help an organization mature and validate where they're at. And in order to do that, what we normally do is start with a EM-SOS assessment. This helps us evaluate in-house resources, evaluate what existing material an organization may have, and then develop and determine the strategy that's best fit for that organization. As I say, you can actually build this yourself, or you can jumpstart by buying a metadata management framework such as EM-SOS. We've got all the answers. We certainly hope that you can actually leverage what we have done already for not only yourself, but for other clients. Go ahead, next slide, Jeff. As we say, you're not the only organization that's looking at that. We've helped many organizations jumpstart their data governance and data modeling journey, and it'd be a pleasure for us to help you in this direction. Next slide, I think this is our last slide, Jeff. So if this is of interest to you, and if you're struggling with how you'd actually go ahead and implement such a metadata management framework for PowerDesigner, we can help. And for an in-depth demonstration of EM-SOS 2.0 with PowerDesigner, or if you'd like to have more information on the metadata management assessment, please feel free to contact me, Robert Lutton. There's my email address. As I say, this session is recorded. We will follow up with this recording to all attendees and registrants. Make sure you get this link, and we'll also post it on a YouTube channel. So with that, I'd like to thank Jeff and Marcy for their input and time, and we look forward to working with our viewers in the near future. Thanks very much indeed. Bye.